Thank you, Stephanie. It's always good to be here at the JCC. It's so nice to be here with you tonight, Sonia.
Likewise.
I'm thrilled to be here celebrating your new book, particularly in my capacity as editor of J, as Stephanie mentioned. So let me just take a quick moment before we get into the real meat of our discussion, just to say that this discussion is really sort of the personification of what we hope happens in the pages of J, which is really interesting discussions about Jewish life in the Bay Area and beyond, Jewish culture, Jewish history. And so I'm thrilled to be able to do this in this capacity. I was just handed, as I came up here, our newest edition coming out tomorrow. And you'll notice up at the top, there's a little QR code. You can scan that QR code after the event this evening to sign up for our newsletter. We have two newsletters, one that comes every day, one that comes on Sunday. It's the way to get all of the best and most important Jewish Bay Area news right into your inbox. So with that being said, welcome everybody. It's beautiful to see such a fantastic turnout tonight. Sonia's book is a fantastic read. You'll hear a little bit of it, and then afterwards you'll have the opportunity to purchase it and get it signed by the author. So to begin, I think it'd be really nice to just to get a sense of your voice, Sonia. If you could read us a little bit from the introduction.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So the introduction comes right after the prologue, and it's a conversation that I'm having with my father. Why do my sister and I not have a religion? Because you can decide when you grow up. But how do I decide? See if religion makes sense to you. Why do my grandparents speak Yiddish? Because they came from Russia. Do all people in Russia speak Yiddish? Of course not, they speak Russian. So why do my grandparents speak Yiddish? Because they are Jewish. Do all Jews speak Yiddish? Only Jews from certain parts of Europe. What do the other ones speak? Why don't you go play? Why do my other grandparents speak Arabic? Because they came from Bethlehem. Isn't that where Jesus is from? Well, that's what they say. So did Jesus speak Arabic? Don't ever ask these questions in public. But we are not in public. No lo hagas. Why can't I ask these questions? Because people get upset about religion. But I was only asking about languages. Silence. Why don't we have normal Colombian names? Your grandparents came from different places, and their names are our names. But we are not like other Colombians. We're not that different. But we are not Catholic. I guess that's true. So then, what are we? We are nothing. But I knew we were so much more.
Thanks, Sonia. So you really start to get a sense of the complexity here from page one. The title of the book, The Roots of the Guava Tree, and then the subtitle, Growing Up Jewish and Arab in Colombia. I think if you could help us set the scene a little bit, when you say growing up Jewish and Arab, as far as your family goes, what exactly did that mean?
Sure. So maybe for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book, I can do a quick preview of who my parents were and who my grandparents were. My parents themselves were born in Colombia. My grandparents were the immigrants. My Arab grandparents came from Bethlehem. They came to Colombia in the 1910s, escaping persecution and forced conscription into the Ottoman Empire, into the army of the Ottoman Empire. And they arrived in Colombia 1910, 1917. My Jewish grandparents came from modern-day Ukraine, and they came to Colombia in the 1930s, escaping anti-Semitism and trying to find better economic opportunities in a Europe that was starting to be ravaged by the Great Depression and other economic forces. My parents, as I said, were born in Colombia. They grew up in different cities, but they met in Bogota in the 1960s. My father moved to Bogota because he was a textile engineer, and at the time the textile industry was started, run by, and in many ways managed by Jews and Arabs, and there was a lot of overlap. So my dad had lots of Jewish friends and colleagues, and one of them invited him to a party in 1960, and that's where he met my mom. They fell in love, and they got married against, well, their families were ultimately accepting, but it was still scandalous, even though they poo-pooed it and said it wasn't really that scandalous. They always downplayed it, but really, I think a lot of people considered it it was not well seen. My parents, however, considered themselves very modern and progressive, and for them, I think they were attracted to all the things they had in common, which was being the children of immigrants, having grown up with very little in the way of material wealth, and working in their grandparents' stores, and having lots of similar values like education and a love of and decency and culture and a love of modernity and being progressive. And so my parents decided in a very utopian way to create a family with no labels, no names, no religion, and move the family to Cali, Colombia, which is a city that had nothing to do with either of their families, and start over in a brand new slate. And that's how I grew up, and that's the setting for the book.
Yeah. And so now we have a bit of the dramatis personae of the characters here. And I wonder if we can sort of now move into the context a little bit. And the context was Colombia at a particularly violent moment in its history. That's where you grew up with these people. And I wonder if you can sort of tell us a little bit about what that was like, and if you think, sort of looking back on that now, if that has impacted you in some way.
Sure. So for some sort of little background on what happened in Colombia in the 1980s, Colombia always had intra-party conflict and violence. And starting in the 50s and 60s, there were also left-wing insurgent guerrillas that were challenging the government for control. But what happened in the 1980s was that drug trafficking became very big due to an increase in demand for cocaine in the Western world. So money was flowing into Colombia, and the drug cartels became very powerful. Criminal organizations challenging the legitimacy of the Colombian state. So in addition to the two-way war, there was a three-way war now funded by narco dollars. And so there were a lot of paramilitary groups and corruption, and everybody had weapons, and there was money flowing to fund one violent act or another. And I think ordinary Colombians really got caught in the crossfire, and it was a really tough time. In the book, I talk about two things that really impacted us, and one of them was the siege of the Palace of Justice in Colombia, and one of the insurgent guerrillas sieged the Palace of Justice, where the Supreme Court of Colombia presided, killing more than half of the justices, and the building burned to the ground, which was very shocking. And after that, in my own personal life, I talk about the kidnapping of the little brother of someone at school, the death of two people that I went to school with who were avenging a kidnapped family member and got caught in the crossfire and in an ambush, as well as the many threats that people had and were forced to leave Colombia rapidly, sometimes overnight, because they were threatened with kidnapping, et cetera, et cetera. So it was sort of this very, like a very violent time, but it was also a time where I was a teenager and living my life, and my family was living their life, and it was an interesting sort of exercise for me to think about it and go back to what it felt like living in a country that was devolving, and yet regular life was still going on. We were still going to school, we were still having dinner, we were still doing all the regular things that people do.
You know, and sort of thinking back on it now, you know, writing a memoir at once the book itself is meant to sort of entertain and inform people, of course, which it does in spades. But also I think creating this book is a learning experience for the writer. And I'm curious what you think you learned in going back all over all of this to turn it into this compelling narrative. What did you learn that you didn't know before?
Sure. So before I tell you what I learned, I just want to quickly talk about what memoir is, in case people aren't familiar with the format. Somebody once asked me why I thought it would be interesting, why I thought other people would be interested in my life, which is a very valid question. Memoirs are not for everybody, and not everybody has to be interested in my life. But I think this person thought that I had written an autobiography, which is sort of the accounting of one life, start to finish, with dates and went to schools and all of that. And I think memoir is very different. Memoir is a slice of life, and so one person can have many memoirs in them about a 5-minute thing that happened to them, about something that happened in a 5-year period, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's a much more limited scope, I think, telling the story of a human being, regular, not regular, that experienced something and came out on the other side. So what I learned from writing the book was that when I was little, I tried to tug at the issue of identity a little too hard. I just yanked it, and the knot just got harder and harder, and I couldn't quite unravel it, partly because I was a child, partly because my parents weren't answering the questions that I needed them to answer, but also because I wasn't really looking at it from the perspective, obviously, of an adult and with hindsight. So this time I went and I took my childhood out, I had sort of put it in a ball and put it in the closet, and I took it out and I thought, all right, I'm not going to yank at it. I'm just going to start looking at it. So here's one little memory. Let's look at this one. Another little memory. Let's look at that one, and start writing about it. And it sort of unfolded into a tapestry where I could see the pattern finally, and I could see all the things that went into it. And some of it wasn't perfect or beautiful, but I could see it written out. And what I learned from that process was that the confusion and frustration of my childhood, and I think in the early chapters is very clear, including the introduction where I'm asking questions that no one's answering, led instead through a process of thinking really about my parents and the family they formed and the reason and the decisions they made, and thinking so deeply about them led me to just a place of great love and appreciation for them. Not that I didn't feel that way before, but it was different than I had been capable of understanding before. So the gift of writing the book was really for me, and reaching a greater understanding of who my parents and grandparents were.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm wondering, just a quick follow-up to that, which is, as a parent yourself now, can you more understand why they might have answered your questions in the way they did than you did previously?
I think so. I've also came to understand that my parents were really trying to protect me and keep me safe, both from probably the rejections and the stings that they experienced in their own lives from about marrying each other, and the sorts of perhaps unpleasant and unkind things that people said. So they were trying to keep me protected, but also because we were growing up in a time in Colombia where, sort of, for example, having certain political opinions was very dangerous, or it was not polite to really talk about not having a faith, for example. So I think their impulse was to keep me safe and to just not give me talking points because I was very chatty. So
that makes sense. I can empathize with them. So you talked a little bit about people asking why would people read your life? In writing the book, did you have a particular audience in mind? Did you have a particular idea or message you were trying to get across in choosing to tell your story?
Mm-hmm. Well, the only audience that was ever going to read this book was me. So I really didn't set out to write a book. What happened was that I became middle-aged a few years ago, like may have happened to some of you. And it's normal, I think, at that point to start looking back at your life and think about your childhood. And the thing that struck me was how completely bifurcated my life felt from my current life, which is big and wonderful and full, but not connected at all in many ways to my childhood. And I think that's very common for immigrants. And so in the process, I just started writing memories, thoughts, and out of that came the book. As I was writing the book, I realized that there were several themes that were emerging: identity, family, and diaspora, and a little bit of history also as a theme. So in my imagined audience, as the book really started to become a book, and I started to realize that it was not just a little writing exercise for me, I thought my audience was people who are interested in identity, and it's a very universal but also very particular, who am I, what am I, but also we all feel this about family. I mean, I'm sure everybody's family in this room is perfectly normal and not at all strange, but maybe there you could understand a little bit or find some of your family members reflected in mine. And diaspora stories, I think, are fascinating. And the diversity of the global Jewish and Arab experience is really interesting. And I thought I could just add a little pebble to a story that's not necessarily the standard story of how people get to places and their experiences. So, and the other piece was history. And I think it was interesting for me to imagine an audience that has only learned about Colombia from the media or the little bits we know, or maybe from certain Netflix series, and sort of reading what it was like for regular people to live through that time.
Yeah, and speaking of regular people, two of the sort of richest and most detailed portraits in the book are of your grandmothers from both sides. Really wonderful characters, really wonderful portrayals. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about these two remarkable women.
Sure. I keep writing, trying to write a piece called "The Day My Jewish Grandmother Met My Arab Grandmother." They only met a few times, and the piece is still unfinished. So maybe my thoughts will still be unfinished about them. But I will say that writing the book gave me a different perspective on them, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. My Arab grandmother was very much the product of her traditional Levantine Christian Arab family. She was married at 15. She had 3 kids before the age of 19, and one more later. She helped my grandfather in the store, and by all accounts, she was the business brains behind the store and should have been allowed to run the store, but that's not how things worked. She was cared for by her sons and her husband, and she not only ran a big household, but also helped an endless stream of immigrants from Bethlehem, because they would always come to my grandfather brought all his siblings over one by one, and so they would live there for years until they got on their feet and were able to go out. So she had so much on her plate, and it never occurred to me until I wrote this book to think, what was it like to be married at 15 and have 4 children before the age of, 25, and run this household and figure things out in that way, in a way that also, she really didn't have a traditional, she was lived in a very traditional world, so her voice was more muffled and maybe more passive-aggressive, sometimes more aggressive, sometimes more passive, but she was definitely just a very strong woman, and I also look like her very much, so she was the relative that I looked the most like. My Jewish grandmother is like no granny in any book you've ever read. She had long red nails. She smoked like a chimney. She spoke Yiddish and told off-color jokes that I didn't realize were off-color jokes because they were all in Yiddish, but apparently she did. She played poker, and she also ran the store, and there was no question who was in charge for her. She was, for sure. And my grandmother came from a small town, as I said before, in Ukraine. And she spoke Yiddish, but she also spoke German, and she spoke Russian, and she was more educated probably than more girls her age. She came from a more affluent and maybe less observant family, so she had more of an education. And I think for her new life in Colombia was not exactly what she had hoped for. And for her, the trauma of losing her entire family in the Holocaust, anybody who was left in her town and in my grandfather's town, the whole family was disappeared. So I think for all my grandparents, they came from worlds that just disappeared after World War II or with the advent of modernity. And wherever they came from was not the place that it is now. So there was just a lot of loss and somewhat displacement. And my parents were the inheritors of these memories and these identities from places that didn't exist anymore.
Then you mentioned people who know about Colombia just from Netflix series, and I remember reading this, like, your grandmother should be the subject of a Netflix series. So,
yes, she would be fantastic.
I hope that happens. So, sort of a related question about the richness and detail with which you portray your grandmothers. The truth is, you portray your entire childhood with this extraordinary richness and level of detail I have to say, as a writer, I was sort of jealous reading this because your recall from childhood seems to be extraordinary, not a trait I share. And so I'm wondering if has it always been that way? Is there something in the writing that triggered these memories?
Mm-hmm.
How did that happen for you?
So it's interesting because I don't really have such a great recall of my childhood, but there were maybe four things that helped me in the writing. One was some of the memories, like some of the near-death experiences, were recorded exactly how I remember them, and because they are so vividly in my memory. The other tool that I used was sensory recall. I think a lot of time, for me anyway, the senses are the pathway to memory. I didn't realize this was the case, but when I went back to Colombia, maybe 20 years ago, on a trip 20 years ago, I went to Cali. I hadn't been there in a while, and I was just flattened by just the green of the mountains as the plane was about to land, and the smell in the air, and the heat, and the smell of sugarcane. All these sensory details that reminded me of my childhood just came flooding back with stories and memories of my friends and what it felt like to be growing up there. Things that I had forgotten because I hadn't been there in a while. So I really used those sensory details to enter the memories and bring them back, and that helped. And then again, obviously I had extensive interviews with my parents and with certain relatives and with friends that I grew up with to make sure that my memories were not some crazy thing that I was imagining, and also to confirm certain details and that sort of thing. And then on the historic side, I tried to the best of my ability to make sure that all the facts and the dates and the figures were correct.
Yeah. So in case you don't believe me about the richness and detail in this book, I asked Sonia if she'd read a little passage from a chapter called The Monkey and the Mango Tree.
Oh. All right. Well, this one is a funny one about my father, who was a very formal person. The Monkey on the Mango Tree. The neighbor's miniature pet monkey, Pancho, a naughty little creature, has been climbing over the red brick wall. The mini primate preens and parades from the highest branches of our mango tree, setting off the dog's frustrated barking, knowing they can't get to him. The monkey also enjoys munching on illicit delicacies such as the Chinese cherries from my father's fickle and failing tree, which he cares for with painstaking effort despite the empirical evidence pointing to its demise. My father loathes this animal, though he is selective about which matters to take up with our neighbors, who also own 2 deer that roam the property like creatures in a Greek myth. My sister and I climb on top of a rusted, unused metal doghouse in our backyard, an archaeological ode to where an old dog used to sleep, and peek over the brick wall at the neighbor's garden. We marvel at all the creatures, including the 2 German shepherds that snarl and lunge at us along the bottom of the fence. We also feel safe above, knowing that the neighbors are indulgent of our intrusions because they also, like my father, pick their battles. The limits of this arrangement become clear one day when my father sits at the white tulip table under the mango tree, sipping a scotch. A rustling up above indicates Pancho's presence. The little monkey makes his way down the trunk and, in a lightning-fast move, jumps on the table. Stunned, my sister and I stare at the scene in silence, furtively eyeing our tall, formal father, who prefers to observe animals from a clinical distance or, better yet, on television. "Well, look at this," our father says, startled, as the furry brown little monkey inspects him with sparkly black eyes from the edge of the table. "Niñas, look at the monkey. We descend from them. It's so clear that evolution is real," he is saying, when he is interrupted by Pancho's jump toward him. His black, rubbery hand reaches into my father's whiskey glass. Before we can take a breath, he picks out one of the cold crystal ice cubes. As the monkey caresses the ice, his small, dark eyes calmly regard my father, who has frozen in mid-sentence. The primate then lifts the cube, dripping with premium scotch, and lifts it to his lips, licking and sucking with pleasure. We all hold our breath. Suddenly, my father springs back to life. Mico maldito, he yells, roaring, astonishing words we have never heard him say. He hurls the rest of the whiskey, glass and all, at Pancho, who scampers off into the mango tree branches, screeching with joy. My father storms into the house while my sister and I look at each other, laughing. Riva, the Mico drank my whiskey, we hear him tell my mother angrily, and we hear her laugh incredulously. We laugh harder. He asks my mother for the neighbor's telephone number. Confrontation is not something he normally chooses. We position ourselves strategically to hear our father exchanging polite but curt words about their monkey. Les agradezco, my father says curtly, thanking the neighbors for whatever they just agreed to do and hanging up the phone. After that, Pancho is tied down in the neighbor's property and we never see him again on our mango tree. There are limits. Evolution might be logical, but nature doesn't always win.
Thanks for reading that. I remember when I was researching my book, and initially I said, I love this story, but I don't know if it's really got the meat to be a book, right, to survive 200 pages. And it was when I realized that there was an actual plot twist in the real story that I said, aha, I've got a book on my hands. Now, you have an actual real-life plot twist in this book, which I'm not going to give away. No spoilers here. But I do wonder, at what point in the process of creating the book did you realize there was a plot twist? And did that impact the way you chose to tell the story?
Sure. I think you're talking about, well, first of all, the plot twist was a plot twist in my life.
Yes.
Also. It really was. It was, I think you're talking about the scene when I'm 14 and I'm in New York and my parents are having for the first time, a conversation I've never heard about how identity, ethnicity, and religion apparently does matter to them, which is not what I was told when I was growing up. And it's the first time that I realized that my parents are not perfect, that my parents don't know everything, that my parents also seem to have questions of their own, and also that they're struggling. And I think it's called coming of age, and it's called the plot twist of your childhood is over, and you are no longer innocent. And all of a sudden, it's like a little bit of the scales fell from my eyes, and I realized that things were more complicated than I had grown to believe. And so how it came out in the book, it was really, a pivotal chapter, but it's also a place where the book changes, just like I did, from a child looking at the past and looking at my parents and my grandparents and who they are and asking questions, what does this mean to you, to looking at my future and me as an adult and as a human being and as a person, and what does this mean to me. And so I think after that, it kind of marks the point in the book where I sort of shift from my childhood to my adolescence. So it was a plot twist in many ways.
Yeah. So, as someone with both Arab and Jewish heritage, and now as someone with a book about that fascinating and unusual background, I imagine some people imagine that you have some unique and special insight, especially now, into the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So 2 questions here. One is, do you? And the second is, either way. Okay, so moving on to the next question. How about them warriors? How does it feel to be someone who I'm assuming people look to for insight about an insoluble, I'm afraid, conflict?
Yeah, so I think many people who have hybrid backgrounds are often asked to have these kinds of opinions for, what do all Jews think, what do all Arabs think, what do all Colombians think, et cetera. And I think it's complicated. And I will say that my parents believed in peace and coexistence, that they were married for 60 years and they focused on the things that they had in common and not the things that they did focus on their differences, but the things that they had in common were what brought them together and kept them together as life partners. And like my parents, I do hope and believe in peace and coexistence, and it seems utopian now, just like my parents, but I really, that's my thought.
Okay. So when you're writing nonfiction, and particularly about family and loved ones and people you know, can be a very fraught exercise. And now, you do have the disclaimer at the beginning of the book that you've sort of changed people's names, et cetera, et cetera. But even so, my experience has always been that the people you think are going to get upset about what you've written aren't usually the ones who get upset. The pushback comes from weird, strange corners that you were not expecting.
Mm-hmm.
That's my experience. I'm curious sort of what the experience has been like for you, both writing about these people, which is one thing, but also their response now that the book is out in the world and in a certain way it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to whoever is reading it.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing. As I said, I did not intend to write a book. I did not intend to, I didn't set out to write this. And then the question was really, I would say the biggest resistance was from me, my own internal compass of, oh my God, this is so personal. Why am I going to put this story out into the world? Do I want to? Is this okay? I think I tortured myself for a long time about it, and then as the book really started forming and turning into a thing, around that time, my father was sick and he died, and after that, it began to shift for me and probably for my family as well, in terms of the book became kind of a form of a legacy and of remembering him and of setting down his life on paper and making him sort of have a real presence, maybe even if it's just a book now. But it became a way to talk about my family as just being human and without shame and there was nothing that was done that was wrong or shameful. And I think it was very liberating for me, actually. And I think my family has, for the most part, been largely supportive. And I haven't had a lot of pushback yet. But I did feel a tremendous sense of responsibility as a memoirist to tell my story, but not take liberties with other people's stories. I think that's one of the hardest things when you're writing a memoir. And unless you're writing about being, the memoir of how you spent 20 years living alone on a mountain, your memoir will be connected to other people and their stories. And it's a tough ethical line to walk. And I really tried very hard to just tell my story and not take liberties with other people's. But
yeah, that makes sense. Did you, I remember when I would reach particularly difficult parts in writing, I would always have this impulse to be like, I just wish I could make something up now. Right? It's much too hard to find the answer, or it's not as interesting. Did you have that? Did you ever sort of think, maybe I should just write a novel?
I thought that many times.
Yeah?
Many times. Initially, one of the things that I did was I took writing classes here in San Francisco at the San Francisco Writers Grotto and at the Salon. They're wonderful organizations if anyone's interested in creative writing. And every single prompt came back to my parents. Every single prompt was about Kali. Every single prompt, like I was just writing about my parents and about my childhood and my grandparents. And finally I thought, I think the universe is telling me that I really need to write this first and then write something else, because I can't get them out of my head. They loom very large as personalities that I didn't understand in my grandparents' stories. And so it seemed disingenuous to fictionalize my life. I didn't want to do that. I thought I just needed to be courageous and talk about what it was, but I can only take that, I could do it for myself. So my name is my name, but I changed everybody else's names and identifying characteristics and, the story, I guess all the stories were, I guess I didn't have to make anything up.
You guess?
That might be, no, I mean, from the, my impetus was to write a novel about something entirely different, but it turns out that my life was right there and I wanted to write about it initially. And then maybe next time I will be definitely, hopefully writing a novel.
Well, I'm glad this one is a memoir because it's a good one. In your story, you describe your struggle to sort of piece together your own identity, not only in terms of religion, but class and culture as well. And as you're doing this, you're constantly being asked, what are you? What are you? And people are suspicious, essentially. And at home, your parents, the answer to that question is, as you read at the beginning, we are nothing. And so, looking back, how do you think growing up with this sense of we are nothing, which really was actually full of meaning, but, you were told we are nothing, how did that shape you?
Yeah, I think, so I want to clarify that the nothing piece is really specific about, in Spanish, no somos nada is we are not a religion. And so that's where it came from. There was something my dad always used to answer when I said, what religion are we? No somos nada. So basically no religion. It was not a comment about self-worth or that. How has it shaped me? I don't think it comes to a giant surprise to many lovely and wonderful friends in the room that I have lived my adult life as a very committed, very interested, very active Jew. I have embraced Judaism as a lifestyle, as an ethical guide, as a spiritual guide. I have really appreciated it in my life, and it gave me a framework that I really wanted and needed when I was growing up. I would say I probably maybe come into Judaism from a slightly different angle than maybe somebody who takes it more for granted. I am always fascinated by the stories of Jewish diaspora and the many, many different experiences that Jews have had all over the world, and that they speak different languages, and that they've carried their Judaism as the constant, and yet we're so many places. And Arabs also are in many different places and have had many different experiences and come in many different religions. So I think I come at religion from a place of hope and maybe a place where it can unite people and not separate people. And I tend to be more interested in kind of the more diverse viewpoints of organized religion. But otherwise, I've found my place.
Good. I'm curious. And maybe this is just, I don't know. I'm going to be interested in the answer to this question. I'm not sure about you guys. We'll see how it goes. But are there particular writers who were influential to you in writing this book, sort of books that you returned to? I mean, I know books that essentially they're items you just sort of steal from them. Writers and books that really you feel like helped you shape this narrative.
Yes. But I think one of the things that really helped me shape the narrative was my interest in literary journalism. I was introduced to literary journalism in college by a college professor and mentor, Norman Sims, who's no longer with us, but he was an incredible teacher. And for those of you who don't know what literary journalism is, it's essentially a nonfiction form of reporting with storytelling. So think maybe New Yorker articles, think Joan Didion, Truman Capote, they all were the sort of the big pioneers in literary journalism. And I think it's really informed the way I write and the way that I read. I really like memoirs probably because they're forms of literary journalism. And so certain memoirs were very influential for me. One of them was The Color of Water by James McBride, where he tells the story of growing up as a Black child with his white mother, and he unfolds the story of her upbringing as well in the book. I think Lucette Lanyato's Man in the Sharkskin Suit was a wonderful inspiration for me. She really brings forth the world of her parents and of herself in childhood, growing up in Alexandria, Cairo. It's in Egypt, but I can't remember if it's Cairo or Alexandria. And she's just really brings such it's so evocative and so beautiful. Running in the Family by Michael Ondaatje. Thank you. Ondaatje is another beautiful memoir of a time and a place that is gone, of his childhood in Sri Lanka. So those sorts of memoirs were really important to me as I learned what I really liked in memoir and what didn't work for me. But I also read writers like Lumpa Jahiri. I love her sort of simple way of bringing forth these very complicated family relationships and and second generation interrelations in the Indian family she portrays. Big admirer of her, or Alice Munro. I love her writing because it's also very understated. And finally, I'm a big admirer of contemporary Colombian novelist Juan Gabriel Vázquez, who also does a lot of historical, his novels are based in historical fact, and he's just a really incredible novelist if you're not familiar with his work. And also Laura Restrepo, she's a contemporary Colombian novelist who does the same thing. She's a reporter, and her novels are incredible. So I have a broad range of influences and authors I like to read.
Yeah, great books. You talked about having a degree in journalism, and I'm curious to know sort of how writing this book was like journalism and also the ways in which it departed from being like journalism.
Yeah. So I would say that my training in journalism served me very well. The 5 W's, who, what, when, where, why, are very important. I read somewhere that somebody said you never send a character out on the page or on the stage if you're a screenwriter without knowing exactly what they want. And that's the 5 W's, right? Who, what, when, where, why, why does this character, et cetera. So I kept those things very much in mind as I was writing, trying to set the stage, trying to set the scene, trying to give readers the background for what I was saying. The ethical need to stay true to the story and not make stuff up and not and really just tell the story in a factual way. Those were all things that my training really helped with. The thing that felt very strange was shifting from third person to first person. It felt really weird in the beginning. I found a way to access my childhood memories by writing in the first person and in the present, the book started, most of the book was written in past tense, and then I switched it to first person. And being very self-focused in the book was also strange as a journalist. It feels completely antithetical to all the things we learned, but I appreciated having the training.
Yeah, that comes through. I'm curious, you mentioned before having taken a course at the Writers' Grotto and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. I would venture to guess that, 85% of people in this audience at some point have thought, I should write my memoir. Oh,
they should.
Maybe higher than 85%. Or I've got a novel I want to write. I'm curious if you could talk about, just, a couple of the challenges involved in writing like this, mm-hmm. and it'd be some of the resources you found in San Francisco that allowed you to open up and actually do it.
Sure. So I think the challenges are just doing it. You have to sit down and you have to figure it out. My challenge was not sitting down to write a book because that's not what I was doing. The challenge was figuring out what to do with the writing that was coming out and how to turn it into a story that was compelling for readers and not just for me. So and because I was trained as a journalist, I was a little rusty on dialogue and scene setting and plotting the entire novel. And so the San Francisco Writers' Grotto has incredible teachers. I took wonderful classes there. Also the Writers' Salon. There's another organization called the Writers, I can't recall exactly. But if you're looking for a guidance or a class on memoir or a class on any kind of genre that you want to write or poetry, I think there's so many wonderful classes and instructors here in San Francisco, and it really does help.
Yeah, it's a great literary city. Final question, then we'll open it up to your questions. I would be remiss if we left tonight and I didn't ask, are you working on anything new now that this book is finished?
Fiction. No. I am. I have a few projects in mind. Some are actually not fiction, contrary to what I just said. And some are memoir related. Some are maybe historical fiction. So starting to think about that.
All right. Can't wait for them.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm sure there are questions from folks in the audience. We've got a couple of microphones that are going to get passed around, and I think Stephanie, will you be calling on people?
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll alternate sides. So we're going to start with this in the back.
Hi, sorry. I don't want to cry or anything, but I know you're a little bit of a melting pot with Colombia and everywhere else. But can you talk a little bit about your Ukrainian grandma? Because I have a friend from Cali, Colombia, from college, and then I have another college friend from Ukraine, and his girlfriend is they're both Ukrainian, but his girlfriend is Ukrainian and Israeli. And if you could talk about that a little more, I'd love that.
About my grandmother in particular?
Like, I know you said they were from modern day Ukraine, but like, do you know where that might be, like, as of today?
Sure. So first of all, I don't think my grandmother would have ever called herself Ukrainian. So this is sort of another contemporary interpretation. I think my grandmother was from a town called Nova Selica, which is right on the border of the crossroads between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire earlier, and Russia. So she remembers. She talks about how she remembers seeing the flag across the railroad tracks change pretty constantly to sort of one day we're Romania, one day we're Bessarabia, one day we're something else. So she grew up speaking many languages, and I think in a family with 5 kids. 3 survived because they left before World War II, and 2 died they died in different ways before the concentration camps, but as a connected to the Holocaust. And I think she really mourned the loss of that world. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
You got it. You briefly touch on your parents' reaction to the Lebanon War in the book. And I was wondering if you could expand how they went from their brief reactions that you talk about and came back together.
Mm-hmm. Their relationship.
How they resolved, how they made it through that. That conflict.
Sure. So the interesting thing about my parents is that their fights were always in private, and I didn't really have a lot of access to their private conversations. That one was I had access to because we were traveling and we were in a hotel room in tight quarters, and it happened to be in 1982 during the Lebanon War. So it's seared in my mind, partially because they were disagreeing and partially because it was the first time I had ever really heard them talking about it. Once we came home, doors were shut again, so there were not a lot of these sort of conversations. But I think, as I said before, my parents, obviously they had their differences, not sugarcoating that, but they stayed married for 60 years, and I think they mostly tried to focus on what they had in common and not on the differences.
Thanks. Hi, I'm really interested in what you've shared about your process, and particularly the maybe 3 times that you said you weren't actually writing a book. And I'm curious about...
Denial.
Right. When you recognized that you were writing a book, when you had the insight that, oh, this could be a book, did you have to reinterpret what you had already written? Was it so intimate to you that you actually had to go back over that territory? And the second part of that question is, I'm just curious, where was that in the flow of the book? Was it in the middle? Was it at the beginning? Like, did you write outward from that point, or in many directions and then organize it? Or was that the point at which you figured out the structure?
That's a good question. I can't tell you exactly when it was. I think I mentioned before that the book for the most part, had been written originally in past tense, and past tense of me now in this age looking back at my childhood. And eventually, when I did realize that it should be a book and that I wanted to see if I could do that, I realized that that didn't seem like the right voice, that I wasn't really accessing the character of who I was as a little girl. And I tried doing it in present tense, first person, and somehow that unlocked kind of the plot. And that's where it really, I think that when I did that, I think the book kind of started coming together.
Hi,
Hi.
Sonia. So I did read the book, and I
Thank you.
understand your parents kept it was all nothing. How about your grandparents? How you would visit both grandparents, and didn't they share with you their upbringing or their beliefs? What, curious.
So I think my Arab grandmother was very concerned that we weren't baptized, and I think she definitely was worried about our souls, and I do think that was a concern for her. But my father was very much in control of that whole conversation about religion, so she really didn't. And my other grandfather had passed away, so I didn't really grow up with my Arab grandfather as a big presence in my life, just the stories about him. My Jewish grandparents, I think in the book I talk about this, they were not religious. I think the Holocaust really deeply impacted them, and I think they were, the idea of faith and having a faith in God that allowed the Holocaust to happen was just something that was too hard for them. This is something that my mom and I speculate about now. It's too late to ask them, but they really were not observant. They were very, very, very connected to being Jews and to being connected to the state of Israel, for example, and things like that. But they were not sharers of the Jewish faith. I didn't really grow up with Judaism until I went to college and found it for myself. So, and they would tell stories, but I didn't listen to their stories, which is such a shame. I really wish I had asked them more questions about what was it like getting off a boat and seeing bananas and black people and mangoes for the first time when you came from Ukraine and you felt that kind of temperature. But these were not necessarily questions that I, thought to ask.
Hello.
Hi.
I so enjoyed your book. It was really beautiful.
Thank you.
And I felt very attached to your sister. And so I'm curious, I have kind of I'm curious to know where your sister is now. Did you have a chance to share with her much about the book? I'm sure you tossed stories back and forth as you were recalling your childhood and your times together. But I'm curious if she also has had sort of a stronger connection to your mother and to her Jewish identity, and the extent to which each of you have looked at your identity in terms of being Jewish, Arab, Latina, and how that manifested for your sister as well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, as I said before, one of the big responsibilities of a memoirist is to stay in your lane and tell your own story, but not take liberties with the stories of others. So I would be happy to answer questions, the same question about myself, but I think my sister is her own person, and maybe one day she'll be here to answer those questions. But
She writes a rebuttal.
yeah, exactly. Yes. That would be lovely. Maybe.
Hi. I also loved your book and found, oddly, lots to relate to in it, coming from a much different background than you. But I was so curious about your symbolism of the roots of the tree that in one place at the beginning feel like roots of something growing and producing. And then as you're leaving, am I doing this wrong? Oh, sorry. As you're leaving, it seems like you're struggling to disentangle from those roots. And so you leave off the book right where I want you to start the next one with what it was like then, looking back on this experience of your immigrant family. Did you see yourself as an immigrant as you went off to college in the United States, or did you, at the time it was very optimistic and you were looking forward to finding your own self, but did you have any experience of being an immigrant yourself?
Yeah, that's such a good question. In the foolishness of being 18, it did not occur to me that I was really becoming just like my grandparents and leaving my home and going somewhere else and starting all over again and starting to make a life for myself. And I think one of the things, we talked a little bit, you asked me about my grandmothers, and I think one of the things that I subconsciously took from them was the strength to do that, because I knew that they had, and I knew that they had somehow found a way to do that. So yes, so I became an immigrant by choice. I chose to leave my family. I chose to leave my home. At the time, I didn't understand that's what I was doing, but that is what happened. And so all of a sudden, I arrived in the United States and had to figure out how to be American and how to be an American college student. Yeah.
We're going to take 2 more questions.
Hi, Sonia.
Hi. Sandy.
It's Sandy. I don't know if you can see me. I wanted to build on this issue of memory because I talked to my sister about memories. My parents are gone. We talked, the whole family, and I remember things differently than she does, and there's certain things that I don't remember that she does. You know, it's this whole, so I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you reconstructed the memories. I mean, I assume you talked to your mother and your sister and how that process worked.
Sure. So I did a lot of interviews with my parents. I also talked to my sister and other family members. And the thing that was the through line was that anything in the book were things that I personally remembered and then confirmed with them. My sister may have other memories, or my parents may have had other memories, but I think what I wrote about, I really tried to stay true to the things that I remembered, and then I just made sure that they were actually how they happened, and what their names, and where the dates, and do you remember this too, and sort of that kind of confirmation. Because everybody has different recollections, especially if you have siblings that are different ages and have different experiences.
One last question.
Hi, Sonia.
Hi.
I'm curious, as a bilingual person, how language impacted your book. I imagine you were remembering a lot of things that occurred in Spanish. And were you writing in English? Were you writing in Spanish? Were you translating? Mm-hmm. And when is the book going to be published in Spanish?
I'm working on on the idea of a translation, but I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. So I'm answering your last question first. I think because I have spent most of my adult life writing in English for work and for college and for grad school and again for work, the book flowed in English. But there were pieces of it that were in Spanish, and one of the challenges were how to have the words in Spanish be there without sort of the awkward translation right next to it, but providing enough context for the reader to understand what was said. That took a little while to figure out how to do. I hope I was successful. But yes, it's strange to write in another language, but it is the language that I've been writing in for most of my adult life, so it wasn't that strange. I think sometimes my friends from Colombia read the book and they find it disconcerting. So for them it's strange, but I don't know that for an American audience I don't know that you notice anything odd.
All right, Sonia, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chanan. Thank you very much.
It's been a
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really a joy to get to celebrate the book's emergence into the world with you and with you good folks. So please join Sonia in the back of the room where she'll be signing books. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Chanan.